नमस्कार सबैजनालाई।
नमस्कार नमस्कार।
सन्चै आरामै हुनुहुन्छ?
आराम छ आराम। तपाईहरु?
हजुर हामी पनि आरामै छौं।
हो। श्यामजी नमस्ते नमस्ते। श्यामजी नमस्ते।
Okay. Welcome and namaste all of you. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Dalit martyrs who sacrificed life and greatly contributed to liberation from century-long discrimination and exploitation in Nepal. I am Mom Biswakarma, Director of Research and Development Institute, Australia. I'm also involved in research at the University of Sydney and teaching at the Australian College of Applied Psychology. I have been contributing to the contemporary Dalit movement in Nepal through articles, research, and publications. I've also published a book entitled Political Transformation in Nepal, Dalit Inequality and Social Justice from Routledge, UK. These webinar series are part of the Social Policy Lab of the Services for Research and Development Institute, Australia. This is an institute established to support development through research-based services. After this discussion, we are intend to prepare a policy briefs, including publish a book. Today, we are discussing on the issues of measuring caste attitudes and discrimination in Nepal. I would like to welcome Professor Richard Bownas from University of Northern Colorado, USA. As you all know, that caste is deeply rooted in most of the South Asian states. Caste and its implications are more prevalent in India and Nepal as compared to other South Asian states. The division of higher and lower and purity and non-purity has been major social problem, even though the national and international legal instruments have outlawed caste-based discrimination. As a consequence of conservative caste hierarchy and discriminatory practices, globally 260 million people have been affected, and more than 170 million people are affected only in South Asia. Due to caste practices, Dalits have been trashed, killed, verbally abused, raped, and deprived from basic human rights in South Asia. Now there has been increasing cases of caste discrimination in overseas, such as UK, US, Australia. This year only, there has been already 45 cases of Dalit atrocities, and 9 of them have been killed in Nepal. In this context, today we are going to discuss the interesting research findings on measuring caste attitudes and discrimination in Nepal. Professor Richard Bownas from University of Northern Colorado is going to present his findings. Now let me introduce Professor Richard Bownas. Professor Richard Bownas earned his bachelor degree from Cambridge University in English Literature and his master's from the London School of Economics in Development Management. His PhD was at Cornell University, where he conducted research into the politics of NGOs and transnational activists in India. He is doing research in Nepal in the last few years on caste and Maoist. He has published articles in journal Contemporary South Asia and is working on book-length study of Dalit politics in Nepal. He has taught a range of courses in comparative politics and international relations at Cornell, Swansea University, UK. After completing his master's degree, Professor Bownas spent time in Nepal, having founded and run an NGO that trained and placed volunteers in Nepali school and social organization. Professor Bownas specializes in the study of the developing world, in particular new social movements and activist networks. He also has research interest in environmental politics and theories of contemporary conflict. Now, let's welcome Professor Richard Bownas. Welcome.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Thank you. You can begin your presentation.
Okay, and I can see some, yeah, there's some people in the waiting room maybe. So are you the co-host? You'll be able to admit them while I'm doing the presentation?
Sure.
Okay, sure. I just wanted to check that. So yeah, nice to meet you all. I think my friend, oh, Stephen Fulmar is here. So hello, Professor Fulmar. And I think my friend Ratner is here. Yes, Ratner is here too. So Resham Ratner BK is here. So at some point I might hand over to him to say something about his portion of this research project. So hopefully he'll still be here then. Okay, so I will switch to my PowerPoint slide in a second. So can you all see that?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry, I have to switch to,
Yeah.
I'm still not quite, yeah, okay, there we go, share screen. Okay, can you all see it? Was that good?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, I just have a nightmare of kind of like giving a presentation and then realizing nobody's seen it or heard it after 20 minutes. Okay, so I am, yeah, from the University of Northern Colorado. I teach political science and international affairs, and I've been coming to Nepal pretty much every summer for the last maybe 7 or 8 years since I did my PhD, which was mainly about India, and working on various projects, often with Resham, with Ratna BK, who you can see here in the meeting, as a co-author, co-researcher. And so I'm just going to present some of our findings about ways of measuring caste discrimination. And this stuff has not yet been published, so I'm embarrassed about that because it's been 2 or 3 years since I collected the data mostly, but it will be shortly. So the research question, basically there isn't much empirical research on patterns of caste discrimination in Nepal. So that is a problem. And not all of us have giant research budgets, like the team at Oxford, for example. So we have to basically find ways of doing research projects on caste discrimination and caste attitude, which doesn't involve contracting to huge, research agencies with, 20, 30 research assistants. So I'm going to talk about 3 ways in which I have tried to get at this problem, and Ratner as well. So these are the 3 projects that I'm going to say something about, and Ratner might say something about the 3rd one in particular. So firstly, a survey instrument which I used in central Nepal with 110 respondents in different locations. Secondly, a complete the story or vignette study amongst class 11 and 12 students, and there were in total 210 respondents to that study. And finally, what I would call a historical paired comparison of 2 ideal type typical locations in Sindhupalchok district, where we were, well, Ratner in particular, was trying to look at the differences over time in caste attitudes and empowerment in a market town versus a village. So 3 different ways in which we can try and get at changes in caste attitude and try to measure caste attitude. And I should just point out at the beginning, the limitation of all of this is that all of this was in central Nepal. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is some of these things could be applied quite easily to other areas of Nepal where caste discrimination may be more severe, more violent, So these are techniques which could be applied elsewhere. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to talk about the survey. So there were 110 separate respondents replying to a survey. This was carried out mostly personally by myself and one research assistant. In some cases, I think I had 2 research assistants. So this was not carried out by some agency where you can't necessarily trust the data you're getting. And we worked in 5 districts in central Nepal. So basically Sindhupalchok, Kathmandu, Lalitpur, Bhaktapur, Kabri, Palanchok. And we worked in about, I think, 15 or 16 separate research sites. Was very careful only to collect, to collect data, maybe 6 or 7 respondents in one research site so that we could get some variation, so that we weren't relying on unusual sites. So again, with the limitations of resources, you're just trying to find places that are typical, and basically we were trying to find differences between semi-urban areas and rural areas. So that was kind of like the motivation of the project, to see, are there big differences in caste attitude between suburban, semi-urban parts of Nepal and more remote rural parts of Nepal. So most of our rural sites obviously were drawn, well, partly from Kabri, but mainly from Sindhupalchok district, which is our main research area. So let me see if I can click on the survey. So just so you can get an idea, this is an English translation of the survey. Oh no, that's not good. Let me see. Okay. Let me just see if I can click on the Word document. Oh, that's not going to work. There's always some technical issue, because now if I click on it, it's going to take me to the next slide. I think what I need to do, oops. I'm going to share it, but I'm not going to put it on full screen. There we go. So I hope you can all see that. So basically we collected some basic demographic information to begin with, age and occupation, and whether people, obviously whether this is an urban or semi-urban site, whether people are active in caste politics, this kind of thing. And then this was the basic way we did the survey. So it's basically on a spectrum of attitudes. So we asked people in their area, how big a problem were the following things? And obviously we were trying to get at, social, cultural, and personal aspects of discrimination. So we asked them about discrimination in hotels, in places of worship, access to public taps and wells. Let me just pull down here. We asked them about discrimination at public events, for example, seating separately during festivals. And we asked them whether there was discrimination to their children, if they had children in school. Going down there, we asked them about government work. So this is more the public sector. Did they feel there was discrimination if they had to do work with the government, if they had to get an ID card, etc.? We asked them about discrimination in rental accommodation if they were living in an urban area. And then we asked frequency questions. So these questions are all about whether they're rating a problem as large to small. And then there were frequency problems where we asked them, for example, do you ever hear derogatory, insulting remarks from other people in your location?
We can't see your file.
Oh, you can't see it?
No.
It says I'm screen sharing. Oh.
You can only see Word.
Can you see the Word document?
There is the Word only, but we can't see
Oh dear. That's okay. So I'm not sure how to, because I brought up the survey. You see, when I clicked on the survey, it just took me to the next page of the presentation. That's the technical issue. And
I think there might be some problem with the hyperlink.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to do it. But yeah, there is a problem with the hyperlink. for some reason it's not showing. It doesn't really matter because I mean, you're not seeing anything special. I'm just reading out what is there on the Word document, which is the survey. So basically there were 15, 16 questions covering all of those areas of discrimination. So basically, yeah, public place discrimination, cultural discrimination, and personal discrimination, and also discrimination in public places like government offices and schools. And the questions, just to make it clear again, they were sort of graded on either a frequency basis, you know, how much did it happen, or a qualitative judgment of whether it was a big problem or less of a big problem for the people we interviewed. And then, in addition to that, we asked people more qualitative questions about reasons why they think caste discrimination may have changed one way or another in their area, and for anecdotes where they should explain any incident of discrimination that occurred. Okay, so can you can all see the PowerPoint again now? So that's what I was just trying to explain the survey, which unfortunately we weren't able to see.
Not yet. I think we can see next one. That one is survey one is.
Can you see
Yeah,
this new
now.
page?
Yeah,
where,
yeah,
where
we
it says
can.
results, traditional discrimination?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. So in that case, I'll switch back to full screen. So sorry about that, the hyperlinks are always tricky. So basically here, I'm just summarizing the data from those 110 interviews we did, where 1 means the most discrimination and 5 the least. So that's basically just, you know, summarizing in quantitative terms the data we found. And I've divided it into semi-urban and rural areas. So as you can see, temple entry was the least. So that's actually, yeah, 4.6 out of 5. That means most people said it was no longer a problem. Remember, this is central Nepal. This is not Nepal as a whole. So this is those 5 districts where we did the research in central Nepal. Festival acceptance, meaning, you know, things like seating separately during festivals, was more in the middle, as was access to public taps and wells. Public insult, meaning whether people have heard derogatory remarks, was also somewhere in the middle. But hotel entry, hotel access was a little less severe. And interestingly enough, I don't know if it's statistically significant, but it was actually more of a problem in semi-urban areas, hotel access, than in rural areas. In government places, we could find very few people at least said in our survey that they had experienced discrimination in government offices, or that their children had experienced discrimination in schools. I think of the 110 people, nobody mentioned any incident in schools, remembering this is, you know, central Nepal. And finally, in the personal sphere, this is perhaps the most interesting set of results. As you can see, there's a big difference between high caste people visiting the homes of Dalits and Dalits visiting high caste homes, visiting meaning entering those homes. And as you can see, that is much less common for people to report that they were entering a high caste home. So that seems to be the one area of sort of traditional personal discrimination that still is very common, in that it's people rarely, Dalits rarely enter the homes of upper caste people, whereas vice versa is quite common that upper caste people are visiting the homes of Dalits. And again, no huge differences there between semi-urban and rural. So, yeah, the findings from that part of the study were that governmental places have the lowest reported incidence of discrimination. So that might be a cause for optimism, in that, yeah, those places which are most under government monitoring and control are the ones, schools and government offices, are places which are not seen as places of discrimination. That the most contentious arenas are still public taps and festivals or events. So whether people have access to those, and I think Ratner is doing some research now on Sindapalchuk on festivals and contention about those. So that still is an area of contention, even in central Nepal. And then there's a striking disparity between upper caste entry into Dalit homes and Dalit entry into upper caste homes, which continues even in the younger population. The other thing which you can't get across from data is a qualitative thing, and this is the extreme lumpiness or clustering of problems. So although I've averaged out the data, that's a bit misleading, because in certain areas, and it's really often just certain clusters in villages, some of these problems remain big problems. So hotel entry and temple entry in particular were problems in particular areas, whereas in other areas they weren't. So as with so many things in Nepal, politics is very local. And that is why we're doing this project on differences between market towns and villages, which I'll talk about later. Now, the other really interesting finding from this study, well, okay, I'll just pass over that. Did people think caste discrimination was getting better or worse? That was another question we asked. And most people over the last sort of 10 years, they said had got better. And interestingly enough, more so in rural areas and semi-urban areas. Why did they think that was? This is one of the more interesting findings. In semi-urban areas, people mentioned things like public awareness and better education for Dalits. Some people mentioned Maoist activities during the war and Dalit activism. Relatively few mentioned law and law enforcement. So these were unprompted reasons that we asked people for. We didn't give a list for them to choose from. However, in the rural areas, one interesting finding is that Maoist activities were mentioned much more. Perhaps it's not surprising, but Maoist activities were actually the second most cited reason for changes in attitude towards caste. So basically for what people felt was an improvement in caste attitudes, a very large number of people mentioned Maoist activities. Notice again that laws and law enforcement are relatively low down there, as is, any specific form of NGO-based Dalit activism. Those things were not mentioned unprompted by many people. Public awareness, I'm not quite sure what that category involves. So there was different things for different people. So it could be government education material. I suspect it's also related to Maoism. So there's a little, those things are conflated or overlap. One interesting finding, again, we asked people as part of the survey what they thought of the term Dalit. And especially in rural areas, most people rejected the term. By rejected, I mean most of them didn't really recognize it. So it was quite surprising finding how few people we talked to, especially in rural areas, actually had heard of the term or understood it. And when, because it means downtrodden and so forth, many of them said they found it insulting. I think maybe they were getting the wrong end of the stick. They didn't quite understand the meaning or purpose of the word Dalit or the term Dalit. But that was certainly an interesting finding, that there is not a strong political understanding of the Dalit identity, especially in rural areas. And we could talk more about that maybe in discussion. Maybe with Ratner will join in there to talk about that. Okay, so leaving behind that survey, the second type of research I've been doing is a story completion or vignette study. And the idea is to give a very short story, which can be completed by students in years 11 and 12. And basically we gave the story to, I wasn't there personally. I tried not to sort of be present so that, the presence of a foreigner might make it, might change the results. So basically we gave about 200 students a short story about an inter-caste relationship. And they completed that during a class time or a free period, usually taking between 20 and 40 minutes to complete those stories. Why did I choose years 11 and 12? Because they are old enough to understand caste names. Most of them clearly recognized the names of the participants in the story, what caste they belong to. But they're young enough maybe to let their true feelings show. So again, subjectively, people in those year groups may be less likely to put on a political face when they are completing these stories. More importantly, we use the stories because the themes, imagery, ideological discourses, and of course hidden biases may become visible when we analyze those completed texts. So just to give you an idea of the texts, I'm not going to try and link to a document because that didn't go very well last time. So there were 4 versions of a story about a love relationship, and they varied according to caste. So in the first version, we have a male Dalit and a female Brahmin. They fall in love. It's the first year of college. They decide to elope. On the day that they are eloping to Pokhara at the bus park, the father sees them getting on a bus in the new bus park. What happens next? So we have this very short introduction. They have to complete the story. We specified that they're studying for a BA so that students wouldn't get lost in a kind of, too much, underage love kind of context, so that they would focus maybe on the caste of the participants. And then, as you can see, we just changed the names of the participants. So in version 2, we have a male Brahmin and a female Dalit. In version 3, we have a male Janajati Tamang and female Brahmin. And then in version 4, we have 2 Brahmins. So an immediate objection you might have is that a lot of people wouldn't recognize the caste of the participants. But of course, that is partly something we're trying to, investigate. And that's true. Maybe about 5 to 10% of the people filling out the study don't seem to have understood the differences in caste, but that's, that's interesting in itself. For example, some people thought that the 2 Brahmins were different castes. However, on the whole, most of the people who finished the study, who finished the story, they clearly recognized that, that caste was an issue, and they responded in kind. So what were the results of this? Now, there are 2 ways of analyzing the results. One of them is sort of quantitative, and perhaps more interestingly, qualitative. So in a quantitative analysis, you're trying to sort of summarize whether, for example, there was a happy ending or an unhappy ending to the story, and does that maybe reflect some hidden bias or ideology in the respondents. And in the qualitative analysis, we're trying to search for themes and images. I think the fancy word might be tropes, which get repeated again and again in the stories. So let me just, I'm not going to give you an example because I'll get lost there. So basically, we can break down the stories into typical endings. As you'd expect, people are drawing on maybe Bollywood movies. They're drawing on various cliches, if you like, or tropes, generic narratives. So there's the unhappy ending, which ends in death, separation, violence, or disillusion. There is the runaway ending, in which the couple marry, but do not reconcile with their families. In other words, they don't go back home. They don't go back to the village or neighborhood. There's the wait until you finish your studies and get a job ending, the sort of bourgeois ending, if you like, the capitalist ending, in which the emphasis is on finishing your study and getting a good job before you marry. And there's a kind of agreement with the family that they should do that. And then there's just a happy ending, more simplistic stories where the couple marry and live happily ever after without any complications. So we could group together the first two as positive endings. I mean, well, no, that's not right. It should be the other way around. The first two as unhappy endings and the second two as negative or unhappy endings. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this data because it's a little confusing, but basically you can imagine we can collect data for different categories. So rural schools, we had 70 rural schools. We had urban schools, 113 urban schools. And we also have differences based on the author. So I asked most of the respondents to put their names on the study so we could see how different castes maybe finished the story differently. So as you can imagine, now I've got more than this, actually. I've got about 210 stories. There are many different ways you can parse, analyze that data according to the person who wrote it, maybe according to gender, according to location. And then you can look for any statistically significant differences once you've categorized the types of endings. But I'm just going to summarize that rather than getting lost in all those numbers, which would be very confusing. Was there a systematic difference between imaginations of mixed caste relations and Brahmin-Brahmin relations? Well, the percentages seem to suggest a slightly more negative view of what would happen if there was a mixed caste relationship, but not by much. And when you do what is called a p-value statistic, so basically you're trying to find out, as I'm sure a lot of you know how to do this, very simple, is it any different than random variation? The truth is it wasn't. So this is for central Nepal again, but if you do that basic statistical analysis, it doesn't seem to make much difference for the respondents, whether they imagine a happy outcome for a mixed caste or same caste relationship. So that was doing a p-value analysis. And that's also true when you look at the caste of the author. So here's some raw data. This is not statistical, but this is just the numbers. So when you look at the caste of the author, their imagination of whether there would be a negative or positive outcome wasn't statistically significantly different for the different castes. Okay, now more. So statistically, we don't find a huge difference when we're categorizing them into positive and negative outcomes. More interesting maybe is a qualitative analysis of the stories. And what I drew out of the stories, among other things, are what I would call the wait and see trope. Wait until you're, educated. And the persuasion trope. And these are kind of interesting because they might indicate social trends amongst younger people and the kind of ideological discourse and imagery that people have when they think of caste. So for example, this is a sort of wait narrative, a classic case where maybe bourgeois values collide with caste prejudice. So I'm just summarizing the story. And if anybody's interested in seeing some of these stories, maybe I can scan them. Actually, it wouldn't be that hard. So I have 210 of these. Who knows, it might be interesting for other people to analyze them and have a look at them. So the father gets angry when he hears the word BK. This is kind of typical, right? So this is the way a lot of the stories start. This is a Brahmin father in a relationship with a Dalit. So he makes his daughter block the boy on social media. The father is a rich, prestigious businessman and casteist. 5 years later, the BK boy becomes a millionaire running a cement company. Okay. He meets the father on business. The father apologizes to the boy and the couple marry with his permission. So there you go. So that's a sort of a case where you can see the idea of commercial values and money overtaking caste as the primary value. This is a slightly melodramatic version, but there are others like that amongst the ones that I analyzed. Another Wade example, the father pulls her away by force and scolds her. The father says, this is a time for study, not marriage. And his caste is not similar. Society will insult us if you marry him and we'll lose prestige. The daughter replies, I'll die without him. The father agrees to call the boy to the house. He says, if you study hard first, we'll consider it. They agree to wait, and after completing studies, getting a good job, they do marry officially. So this is a less dramatic, less melodramatic, less Bollywood sort of version. But you can see the similar sets of values underlying it. The idea that study, job, money, career could trump traditional loss of prestige in the village. So these kids, these class 10, 11 kids are sort of specifically seeing a kind of social change, social conflict going on in values. Perhaps even more interesting, I think, is this persuasion narrative. And I could go into a lot more detail of this, but basically the idea of either authorities or the kids persuading the parents that they should change their views on caste. So in this example, the father takes the couple to the police station by force, jabardasti. He asks if they're in love. He tells the boy, you have no similarities in culture, custom, religion, or caste. But the police tell the father he's wrong in his attitude of discrimination. The couple marry and become an example of intercaste marriage for the community. And the author, the student, ends with a comment, we should accept this kind of marriage and promote it. And I've chosen a slightly strange example there where the police, although there were a few like this, the police are the ones who persuade or educate the father. But in many cases, it's the kids, either the son or the daughter, who manages to persuade the casteist father that they should change, they should keep up with modernity, they should abandon superstition and accept the rightness of love. Okay, so one interesting finding based on that, when we went to rural schools in Maoist influenced areas, so this kind of links with what I was saying about from the study, the survey earlier, that schools in Maoist affected areas, for example, Tulo Shirali in Sindhupalchok district, displayed more radical critiques of caste. So I don't have examples I can pull up right now, but basically this kind of explicit, radical, left-wing critique of caste, that kind of language comes over more over in the rural schools, especially from Maoist affected areas, than it did in the urban schools. So again, you get a flavor of the kind of ways you can use these vignette studies. This is really just, on the surface, I've given you a few examples. There are other tropes. Obviously, gender plays a role as well. To what extent are the daughters the active agents in the stories as opposed to the sons? And one interesting thing also, again, this is central Nepal, is the absence of what I would say directly casteist narratives. So there were only 2 or 3 out of 200 stories which seem to reflect prejudice towards Dalits in terms of stereotypical identification of Dalits as womanizers, and often this was the Tamang case as well. For example, here the Dalit boy is a liar, he's a womanizer, the friend warns her about him, but she doesn't listen. This may have been a joke though, this one, because this was actually by a Dalit author. There were 2 or 3 others of that kind, not by Dalit authors, but very few. Again, what does that mean? Does it mean these students are being cautious and politically correct in what they write? It might do. But one way of testing that was not asking students to write their names. So mostly students were writing their names on the stories so that I could analyze whether there were differences by caste. But in the last batch of 30 stories, I asked specifically the teacher to tell the students not to put their names on it. But there was no difference in the outcomes. So again, that's a little test. Whether statistically that stands up or not, I don't know. There were 30 of those from a rural school, and there was no difference. In fact, I think in those, the outcomes were even happier than in the ones where they didn't put their name, where they did put their name. So there was no difference, basically, statistically, when I asked the students not to write their name on the response. So pausing for a second, these 2 instruments, the survey instrument and the vignettes, I would recommend them to researchers, especially who don't have a lot of resources, in that They are quick mobile measures. They can add to other research projects. If any of you are doing research, I'd be interested. I'm happy to send you our survey instrument. And then you could make direct comparisons with what we found in those areas in central Nepal. It would be very interesting. I would want to do this in the coming years, to use the same instruments in other parts of Nepal, in the Terai, in the former Maoist strongholds in the west, in the places where the recent atrocities have taken place, for example, would be very interesting. And so that's one way you could use these two instruments, right? So looking at different locations, regions, but the other way is generationally. So it would be great. I'd be very interested to go back to schools, for example, at 5-year intervals, and do the same vignette study to see if the similar tropes are coming up, or maybe different kinds of tropes, different kinds of narratives are emerging in what students write, whether there's any statistical change in the way people respond to intercaste and same caste relationships. Okay, and then finally, and so this is the third project we're involved in terms of measuring caste attitude. And this is primarily Ratna BK's project, but I'm going to just summarize it a little bit, and then if he's still here, maybe hand over to him to say a little bit about his project. This is a historical paired comparison of two locations over time. We have chosen, or Ratna has chosen, Chotra and Kubindi in Sindhupalchok district. And basically the idea is to use these as ideal types. So in sociology, an ideal type, this comes from the sociologist Max Weber. It means you're choosing a location which you think is kind of typical of the causes and consequences of social change which have happened in a place. And you're examining it in depth in the belief that it will reflect a larger group of cases, right? The society as a whole. So that's what an ideal type is. So we're looking at one modernizing market town, Chotra, obviously the district capital of Sindhupalchok, and a market center for that region of Nepal. And not far from Chotra is Kubindi, which is about an hour's walk, but nevertheless much less modernized, much less part of modern market systems, much less integrated into modern labor markets. And basically we're looking over the last 20, 30, maybe even 40 years, how did Dalits get empowered over time in that market town? How did attitudes change? And how did they get left behind in the village? And so what Ratner has done is measured caste discrimination in the two locations. And he's also created a kind of historical narrative of how economic change is linked to political and social change. So for example, Dalits in Chotra were able to reject feudal economic ties back even in the 1980s. And that had longer term consequences for discrimination and social change in Chotra. Whereas in Kubindi, in the village, Dalits tended to get stuck in patterns of patron-client relationship until quite recently. And so the consequence of that was that political and social empowerment occurred in Chotra, but much less so in Kubindi, despite the fact that in Kubindi there were Maoist interventions. So again, that's a kind of paradox which this study can help resolve, that even though there were these top-down interventions by Maoists in Kubindi, which was a big Maoist hotspot, attitudes towards caste and caste discrimination has not changed as much as it did in neighboring Chotra. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing there. And maybe if Ratna is still here, he might like to say something about that work on Chotra and Kubindi.
Ratnaji, are you there?
Is Resham here?
I can't see.
He may have lost his internet.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, so I can say some more about that if people have questions, and if he comes back, I'm sure he can answer some questions about that. Okay. Yeah. Well, I pretty much finished, so I'm happy to answer questions about any of those elements.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Richard, for your interesting research project and findings as well. Ratnaji, are you there? Would you like to add? add something on. You're on mute. Let me unmute you. Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, it's fine now.
Me, friend?
Keep talking. Ratnaji, bonus.
Well, all I need to tell is giving thank you to Mr. Richard Bownas. I think he explained very well the findings that we had studied, especially I had a research comparing the two locations, a stronghold Maoist area and the urban or semi-urban area Chotara. The findings is same as Richard already explained, how the Dalit social movement and market and education has a positive impact, and the less education, the less uh, marketization, uh, but there is a political consciousness, but limited only towards non-Dalit people. Dalit were used as a shelter group. So even though there was a big political influence of them, only the politics would not empower to Dalit community, and uh, and the top leader or the political party with whom non-Dalit leaders are associated, they would not lead, they would not understand the in-depth aspiration of Dalit people. This is the example from Kubinde. Whereas the Dalit community itself is their voice in Chotara and involve a non-formal or off-farm activities, and they reduce gradually their pattern-client relationship, join in the market, and become educated by their hardship. Finally, enlarge the aspiration or liberation or empower them. Uh, Strongly comparing to the Kubindi. So what we can tell in finding that only the political philosophy that Maoist or other party would say may empower to the Dalit people is not absolutely correct. It could be the relatively, relatively adding points in some extent, but empowering from political, political, socially, educationally, and the impact of market would empower to them, which Richard already explained well, I think. This is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratnaji. Yeah, I have one follow-up question in regards to Richard's presentation, that is about the rejection of Dalit term in rural area. So could you please explain a bit more what is specific aspect you are trying to referring on? No, you are trying to
Yeah,
refer.
I think I got to be careful using the term rejection. Rejection is a bit of an ambiguous word because I think it's more ignorance.
Okay.
It's just, I was surprised. Obviously, I was there for most of the interviews. I was surprised how few people in, these are, probably less literate, maybe semi-literate people in rural areas. They just had never heard of the term. And this is not really in very remote areas. This is just within 30 minutes walk of a market town like Chotra. That some of the smaller villages on the hillsides, they just had not, they were surprised at it, and they thought, their assumption was that it was an insult. So when we said, what do you think of the term Dalit? Do you use the term Dalit for yourself? They said, no, well, they were surprised. And then they said, well, is that some kind of insulting term? No, we don't approve of these insulting terms, right? So it was an interesting misunderstanding. They didn't see it as an empowering term. They'd never heard of it. And then they assumed it was some external insult. So
yeah, it's more on misunderstanding of the definition.
Yeah. Yes. I don't think it's some sophisticated political theory they have. It's not that. It's just that they don't understand it.
Okay, thank you. We have Professor Steve Fulmer from US. So now I'd like to request him for quick remarks and question if he has remarks on your presentation. Welcome.
Namaste, everybody. Hello, Richard. Hello,
Hello.
Ratna, Mom. First, just to follow up on your last comment, Richard, I've also heard among some Dalit activists, some of them are rejecting the term Dalit, and they feel that the intent, they understand the intent to be empowering, so to speak, but that it can be interpreted as an insult. And so there is some discussion that I've seen anyway about whether or not they should search for a new term. But my question is really about the survey and some questions that I was thinking that perhaps may have been included that might have influenced the results in one way or another. So did you think about maybe asking about discrimination in places like restaurants and tea shops? My sense is that more people that I know have experienced discrimination in tea shops than they have in hotels, because hotels can be kind of a neutral place. And then further than that, discrimination in marriage, of course, which is what you get at in the vignettes. But if you'd speak to those two things and maybe.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there may be a semantic problem there, because I think in village areas by hotel, they mean tea shop often. That's that. Yeah, yeah. So basically, when we were doing the interviews, we kind of clarified that. So I think I used the word hotel because that's the way people in smaller villages would refer to a place where you go to have tea or whatever. So that maybe, yeah. And just to emphasize, like I said in the presentation, that is a problem. But it's clustered. It's clumpy, right? You go to one very small subdivision, and everybody says there's a problem with this tea shop over here, right? This hotel or tea shop, and you walk just half a kilometer down the road, and there's nobody says there's any problem at all. So this is one of those things that's extremely localized. So it's a little dangerous to make averages. I think in Nepal, more than almost any other place, this is why social data is a little problematic, because everything is so clumpy. And of course, that's partly why me and Ratna are trying to do this study of Chotra and Kubindi, two places that are really just 1 hour apart, but which are totally different worlds, different universes almost, based on their social trajectory, social history. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. But you're right. You're absolutely right. There's still, even quite recently, people were reporting difficulties, embarrassment, going to tea shops. There's a question, where you sit, cleaning your own utensils. I mean, Ratner has experienced this himself, right? In Chotra, when he was a kid, there was a program about this there. So in living memory, I think that's still a big problem. Yeah, absolutely.
If I could just follow up, well, and first I should have said, how much I have enjoyed the presentation, and the data, the methods that you're using are so useful to all of us. But in your last response, I was just thinking how you might combine a couple of your techniques And I'm thinking of the ideal type methodology that that Ratna used, and you could do this kind of on a micro level. You could go to the problematic tea shop and do an intense study there, and then the more open tea shop, and do an intense study there, and look at how, you know, how did these two trajectories historically play out, so that and of course there have got to be things like personality or personal experiences and personal traits of shop owners that could be involved that are kind of beyond. Just one experience I had was with a Dalit man in Lalitpur who opened a tea shop of his own, and in fact there was another tea shop owned by Dalits just down the road, and in the evening high caste men would come to the tea shop, and there was this joke that they would sit there openly drinking Rakshi with the Dalit men, but when another high caste man would walk by, they would hide their hide their glass from view so that they wouldn't be disrespected by the people in their own communities. So that kind of, I think that kind of follow up to your studies could also enrich it.
Yeah,
great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Steve and Richard as well. I'll take a few more questions from participants. There are a few questions in chat box. So I'm scrolling now the questions. Kirpa Daliki, he says, what do you think of the best ways to eradicate caste discrimination from Nepal, balancing reformation or annihilation of caste sentiment? That is one question. If you'd like to take note.
Well, that's,
Yep. And I have one more question. It's not really question, it's like experience. One participant in Rai, I think, he says, I'm one of the victim of intercaste marriage. In my experience, mixed caste relationship is not so easy. That's the comment. And if there is question more, let's see. Yeah, this Sunarji, he writes that given the present context in line with your finding, what strategic approach could be effective to continue fighting against caste-based discrimination in public as well as personal spheres? These are the questions for now. Then I can take more later.
Yeah, well, obviously, I mean, the first two studies, the survey and the vignette study, don't speak directly to policy. But I think the project I'm working on with Ratna, the comparing Chotra and Kubindi, the market town and the village, does have policy implications. One, as Ratna was saying, I think one of the interesting things is how the top-down approaches in Kubindi made very little difference because of economic circumstances, because people were stuck in patron-client relationships and the legacy of those. So if anything, the lesson is access to credit and access to the modern labor market and training, right? So it's basic economic empowerment and the equalization of opportunities. So in Chotra, which Ratna describes, Dalit, especially BK caste, were able to create economic networks linking them to Kathmandu. Maybe that's something that we should focus on in policy terms. Often people don't talk that much about the economic structure of caste oppression, right? And how that and how that leads to political and social consequences. So I think that study could really pull out some of those implications. And about caste, yeah, just to be clear, the vignette study is not a study of intercaste marriage. It's really just using imaginary intercaste marriage as a way to encourage younger people to express what might be hidden biases. So obviously real life intercaste marriage is not going to be as easy as these young kids imagine, but it's just a way to draw out, a dramatic way to try to get them to bring out various tropes and discourses. Maybe there are others. Maybe somebody could suggest. Nobody's really suggested anything. Like I think intercaste friendship would be not quite dramatic enough. But then there's a danger that it does bring out these kind of Bollywood type discourses and sort of maybe melodramatic stuff, which maybe interferes with the response. But it's a tricky one to get right. You've got to have something which makes the students interested enough to write something. Yeah, and Sita had a question. There's a contradiction in less discrimination in Maoist influenced area, but not empowered Dalit. Yeah, I mean, this is something I've worked on in the past. I've got an essay from, I think, 2015 in Contemporary South Asia, the journal, on Maoist affected areas and Dalit discrimination. And I think me and Ratna would agree that there has to be organic empowerment first, and then local Dalits control Maoist leadership, right? So in some parts of Western Nepal, because Dalits were already empowered, they were able to kind of use the Maoist movement for their own interests. But in a place like Kubindi in Sindhapalchuk, where Dalits were stuck in patron-client relationships economically, they were not empowered, and they were really just used as tools by the Maoists, just symbolically, right? And the various symbolic things the Maoists did, you know, forcing people to eat together and stuff like that, it made no difference. It had no lasting impact. So I think that would be my finding about Maoist influence.
Okay. I have one follow-up question to the rejection. You said not to say rejection, but yeah.
It was a
Yeah,
careless word, actually.
kind of denial on Dalit term. So was there any effort to mention a positive narrative of the Dalit term, or
You mean from respondents?
yeah?
No, because I think they were very focused on the local caste structure, local kinship, rather than on bigger questions. So there's certainly a lack of politicization amongst some rural groups for sure on those issues. They're more focused on local caste relations than on larger strategic concepts like Dalit. Yeah.
Okay.
But you're right. I mean, it would be an interesting, that's a different project, right? Asking people what terms they would use, as kind of bottom-up approach.
We have now observed, you know, most of the younger generation, they are not in that line, or maybe not in favor of the term we use.
But what alternative terms do they suggest? Do they have?
Not really alternative terms. Yeah, there are of course some group of people, they are using silpi, like skillful people, something like that.
Yeah.
But it's not politicized.
What do you think? Do you think it's
sure.
is it the Indian influence? I mean, is it the overwhelming influence of Dalit movement in India that makes it kind of necessary to use the term? I mean, do you think that's part of it?
The second part of it, or I don't think.
No. Okay.
Yeah. Punaji, are you there?
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard, for your excellent presentations. And I have a little bit queries or some of my reflection on methodological part. And you have rightly employed the qualitative methods. That's very much appreciated. But I didn't see statistical measures, even p-value, and there is no any statistical significance. And I am also facing that sort of problems while employing the quantitative methods. And what is your reflections? Either there might be some sort of the way of exploring or probing the way we are doing, or there is some kind of or the problems that people are hesitating to express as we are expecting. And what is your quick reflection on that?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Please,
I'm basically a qualitative social scientist. But I did think it was important because I was presenting raw data, and it did look sometimes as if there was something statistically significant, a difference. I definitely had to do that p-value a statistic to show that there wasn't. So the p-value just means the null hypothesis that there's no difference stands, right? And then obviously it gives you a number like 0.14, 0.2 or whatever. That tells you there's a 1 in 5 chance if it's 0.2 that it was just by chance that there was a difference. You can tell I'm not a quantitative social scientist, but but basically, but that is a finding, right? I mean, the fact that the p-value was negative, that there was no statistically significant difference, that is itself a positive finding. It suggests that at least in these central Nepali areas, there's not direct evidence of bias or a kind of different imagination of what's going to happen to intercaste versus same caste couples. But you're quite right. There's absolutely no way you can be sure people are not just being politically correct, right? I mean, that's the drawback. That's why I try to control for that by doing one study where they don't put their names, an anonymous study, hoping that maybe there would be differences, but there weren't. There were no differences. And again, I think choosing kids of that age was an attempt to try to prevent too much political correctness creeping in, because they're probably too young to care that much what people think of their views on caste. That was my thinking. But no, there's absolutely no way you can be sure what's really going on in their heads, right? That's you just can't do that. You can't do a brain study. Maybe you could actually if you had the resources, but yeah, there is a limitation.
Also,
Okay.
I'm also facing the similar kind of the problem, while facing that sort of problem, and quickly I jump into the some kind of gathering the different kind of the qualitative cases, and also you have rightly pointed out or tailing or VigNet study or that sort of thing that rightly complement what are the lacking that we are facing the problem through the quantitative methods. If you look at or compare the data or evidences that we generated from the two different sets, and if you look at the different inferences that you are drawing from the quantitative, that is totally insignificant. And if you look at some sort of the evidences that we generate from the qualitative, that totally different. And also we should be critically able to critique that there might be some kind of the mismatch between the qualitative and quantitative, and we should be able to rightly complement and
Yeah.
the both the kind of. And also I would like to request, because you have a good academic background, and you should be able to critique on and what are some kind of the limitation and lacking
Oh yeah.
between two different methods, and so that we should be able to rightly pinpoint some kind of the evidences, and so that rightly the communities or scientific communities and policy mainstream and others should be rightly be communicated in the right way. That's the ethical questions for all the researchers, not only to you, for us as well. Right?
Yes.
Are you getting my point?
Well, I
Okay.
mean,
And also I have
I
a.
think.
Okay, please.
Well, I think I get your point. I mean, but clearly, yeah. I mean, admitting there's no statistical. I mean, I'm just. I don't think the qualitative and quantitative analysis was contradictory, though. I mean, I think they were complementary, really. There was no statistical difference between the positive and negative cases. So, that sort of evidence for a lack of discriminatory thought. And the same thing came over in the qualitative. There were very few outright casteist, anti-caste in the studies. But the limitation is obviously you can never use a study like that to assume causality, right? It's just interesting to know what tropes are out there, right? What discourse is out there. That tells you something about education of kids on caste issues. For example, a lot of them quote Lakshmi Prasad Devgata on caste. Others quote things which seem to have come from maybe Maoist influenced discourse in rural areas. So that you can draw some conclusions from that. right? You can say that this is out there in society and it's entering into these short stories. You can see that circulating around, but it doesn't
Sure,
mean
sure.
when they grow up, these kids are going to be anti-caste activists or anything, right? I mean, you can't draw those kind of conclusions.
Okay, thank you so much, Richard.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Punaji and Richard. There are a few hands raised for a question. So now I'd like to ask Indira Shankar. Indira Shankar,
Good,
could you please
good
ask your
evening.
question?
Yeah, uh, actually, it's not my question, but I like to share my experience because I'm one of the, I can say, not a victim, but I am the one of the person of intercaste marriage. I got married before 8 years ago with so-called like high caste is Srestha community. But what I experienced that the issue of caste discrimination is not a legal issue; it is more social justice. And what I have seen that even if I approach, I have not approached it. Why I have not approached to get a justice? Because when we go to the district administration office, at first they denied to accept the case or they don't want to entertain the case. Even if I even if they entertain the case, we can't get social justice because for example I got intercaste marriage and to some extent my within my immediate family they somehow accept it, but with neighboring community because of their mental pressure and like they what to say yeah they pressurized to my immediate family, so also they became far from me. So what I thought like the issue of caste discrimination is more social justice, so we have to also raise the issue of social justice as well as the legal justice. So but for that what we need to do that uh, okay we can't get like social justice in this period because how we grown up. Okay, if I go with the district administration office, I may be found, I may be talked with the district administration officer, he may be 40 years or 50 years old, and I can imagine or we can imagine how he grown up when he was child. He also grown up in very discrimination society, so he can't give justice even though he's educated, even though he has authority, he has authority to give a justice, but because of his mindset he can give a justice. So what we need to do, like we have to change the curriculum, and also we have to empower we have to empower not empower sensitize more non-dalit community and non-dalit groups. So what we are more disaggregated and more fragmented in our within the dalit community. So I don't think so if we go like only dalit we can't get a justice. That is my observation and experience. And you see there are so many, like we can see recently the Navraj became yeah he was killed by so elite caste, but there are so many people are killed by mentality even though we are live. That is the bitter reality of intercaste marriage or whoever experience caste discrimination in the society. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Indira Sankarji, for your remarks and observation. Now, there is one more participant, Sajana Tolange. Um, so I'd like to give space to her. Sajana ji.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Mom. Thank you, Richard, for your very interesting presentation. The findings most reflected the Nepali society based on caste system. Now we have strong evidence, research evidence to prove that caste system has negative impacts in society. Since you presented the findings on the category rural and semi-urban, I just wanted to know that if you have six disaggregated data of these research. Thank you.
Thank you, Sajana ji. Professor Richard, would you like to respond that question?
Um, yeah, I think that was difficult. Yeah, that's difficult because basically it's household based. So you go from one household, and then obviously it's quite difficult to isolate men and women. So often, if you're interviewing the wife, the husband will be there, or maybe if you're interviewing a younger woman, maybe an older male relative will be there. So you can't be sure that people are speaking completely independently. So when I say 110 respondents, it could be complicated to say that they are speaking as individuals. Maybe they're speaking more as households, and it's household experience. You know, does your household have experience of kids being discriminated in school, that kind of thing? But you do raise an interesting question, yeah, that maybe there's a difference in male and female response. I think for the kind of questions we were asking, probably not, because the questions are more about social, publicly visible things, like, is there discrimination in the temple, the water tap around here? Women would probably know more about some of these things, especially access to water. But generally, those were publicly available things that everybody knew about. But I think, you raise an important point that maybe there should be questions about, which are specifically geared to women. But my questions were not really specifically gender specific. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few more questions. Gazada Suna, he has written that what are the strategy for factor to reduce the unfriendly attitude towards Dalit communities in the context of untouchability? That is question. Tesunaji, again, he has written that there is a need of whether positive interpretation of the term Dalit and whether dissemination is needed. Otherwise, it will be used as synonym of the term untouchable that will be huge counterproduct. And that's more of, yeah, remarks or observation. So would you like to respond the question of Gazadar Sunaji?
Yeah, could you just repeat the
Yeah,
Sunaji?
what are the strategy or factor to reduce the unfriendly attitude towards Dalit communities in the context of untouchability?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I sort of replied to that before. I mean, I think direct top-down approaches don't work very well. And I think the Maoists are a test case for that, almost an experiment, right? In what happens when you have a very strong, you have to have something bottom up as well. So the Maoist approach works, this kind of top-down education, and maybe even, well, they force people, right, to sit together, to eat together, who wouldn't have done otherwise. But if you don't have already a level of Dalit freedom from patron-client relationships and Dalits entering the modern workplace, I don't think that top-down approach will work. So for me, focusing more on economic issues would be really important. I think a lot, NGOs generally take the legal or cultural approach, right? I think we need more people to focus on economic empowerment. We need more studies of why a lot of Dalit people are excluded from the modern labor market, why they haven't been able to update skills, how it may be difficult for people to access credit markets, to get credit at a decent rate, to work with banks. So for me, that's the importance of the work Ratner is doing, and I'm working with him on that, obviously, this qualitative study. And I think it would lead to that kind of answer.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Now I've got one question in relation to your survey. So one of the participants, Dol Sunar, he's asking that which districts were covered for this survey. So you mentioned that it's a central part of Nepal. So
yeah, that's a limitation. Yeah, I mean that was a limitation of resources and time. I would love to do the same study, maybe next year, in another area of Nepal. I'm thinking maybe the Terai would make sense.
Yeah.
Then that would actually make a more interesting study because you could compare two regions, and I suspect you would have very different results in some parts of the Terai where discrimination is far more severe. But the good thing is I have that instrument there. I have the data from central Nepal. So now I could apply that elsewhere. So I think that's an opportunity, but it's definitely a limitation. I would never claim that this is saying anything about discrimination in Nepal as a whole. Definitely not.
Exactly. Okay, I don't see any more questions from other participants. So I'd like to request all the participants, if you have any question, you can ask now. If not, then we'll conclude this session today.
Dr. Mom, should I put
Yeah,
quickly concern?
yeah, no worries.
Uh, uh, Richard, and actually, if I have heard you very rightly, and you have a plan to carry out your research or the survey where the atrocity has recently happened or genocides,
Mm,
and I would appreciate if you explain a little bit more, and also I'll be happy to contribute and what are the different scenario. This is my one part, and my another question is that the historical studies that you are trying to focus on the more economic and labor part that you are carrying out together with the Ratnaji, and what sort of the theoretical engagements that you really interested in, and could you please highlight that theoretical engagement so that we'll also be benefited that you are applying for that historical study or attitudinal part of that sort of things that you have already mentioned. And I think also I would appreciate if you could share some of your findings and what sort of train or that sort of things that you have observed so far. My two different set of the questions that I'm trying to ask you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't have a concrete plan at the moment, but I think it would be a great idea to carry out the survey in that area where the recent atrocities took place. Maybe even the vignette study. I mean, maybe I could go to schools and do that same story study. I think that would be interesting
Mm,
to see if there were differences in the kind of narratives that came out of those stories. I should be in Nepal
mm,
next summer if the COVID thing is cleared
mm,
up. So with a bit fingers crossed, I should be able to do studies in other parts of Nepal. But at the moment, it's up in the air, right? I don't have a concrete plan or funding for that. But all I know is
okay.
I'm in Nepal every summer, and I would really like to do the survey in other places. Um,
Mm,
really, I suppose Ratna should answer the other question, which is about the theoretical commitments behind the qualitative study. Did Ratna want to say anything about which theories he was mostly concerned with in the Kubindi Chotra study?
Well, I mean, uh, let's let me talk a little bit. Actually, the finding says that only the political empowerment would not be the path of Dalit emancipation or liberation. Dalit has a multifaceted problem, so there must be the multi-dimensional approach. I have gone through the unequal citizens, uh, and I mean, written by Lane Binet and political scientist Nancy Fraser, where three R, QR, like recognition, representation, and redistribution uh, approaches they have stipulated. So on the top of that, if there would be the program uh, to eradicate the untouchability practices, it could be the legal part. And combined with that legal, I mean, intervention by the state, we may be able to impact the caste structure of Nepali society and open the path of, I mean, emancipation or liberation. So, so I had applied that theory, which they carried out. That's what I mean.
Thank you, Ratnaji. So,
Can I ask one, like, it's not a question, but I want to ask something. Uh, if we compare with last month Rukum um, genocide incident, it is completely shocking to Nepali society after, Maoist revolution, because that was the uh, that district was the point where Maoist was, uh, what we call, uh, uh, born. So it is shocking. We are assuming, and we were hoping that Maoist revolution was helping to eradicate the caste-based discrimination, or all kind of discrimination. But after a decade, uh, that incident remind us that Maoist revolution wasn't uh, big enough to remove that discrimination. How it's happening, or is it, we can say that Maoist revolution uh, was not appropriate, or was not enough to reduce the caste-based discrimination. Why it's Maoist revolution was going back? What is the reason? Uh, I think I could make clear, or I don't know, but I tried.
I, yeah, I agree. And that is because only in very few areas did the Maoists actually work with Dalit leaders. So in Calicut district, for example, there were some powerful Dalit leaders within the Maoist movement, and they forced the Maoists to focus on discrimination questions. I think in other areas that was less true, because maybe Dalits were not the core group. Maybe it was other Janajadi groups who were the core group of the Maoists in other areas. So only when Dalits were able to take control of the local Maoist movement, if you like, did it really make a difference, a lasting difference to discrimination. We found that in Calicut district, but not, maybe it could be in Rukum that hasn't happened, because Dalits were not in control of the Maoists there, right? They were just being used as foot soldiers. So yeah, I would completely agree with your comment.
Thank you.
yeah, thank you, Professor Richard. Dolaji, would you like to ask some question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mom sir, and thank you so much, Richard, for your presentation. My just a reflection after going through several presentations that were based on surveys regarding caste-based discriminations. Uh, the surveys and research findings say that there is less caste-based discrimination evidences found in the societies, particularly like a relationship, friendship with people, generally, and the youths. They don't think there is caste-based discrimination in the society. Uh, the survey has those kinds of responses from the participants that they don't think discrimination exists in their own societies. There are some sort of like evidences that in your presentation also bringing Dalit people in the house of non-Dalit people has high consequence in the survey. Similarly, regarding marriage, there is one another factor that has high consequence in the caste-based discrimination. What I have experienced is, even though there are a very limited number of factors that affect caste-based discrimination, but they have very high, weightage. They consequence very negatively. Even we see recently there are some of the incidents, Rukum or recently in Kalikot, there are several continuous activities, continuous uh, uh, deaths happening in province 2 in Nepal. Just today, one Dalit youth has been killed, uh, though the investigation is going on. Uh, so I don't know whether I will be right or wrong, but should uh, our surveys be focused more deeply? Um, we just go to community and ask people whether they feel safe or unsafe, or they feel caste-based discrimination is there or not. And generally, as you previously mentioned, what happens in their mind, we can't control. Whatever they say, we have to believe. But the facts and evidences, like the incidents, what has been happening in the societies, they are totally negative, totally opposite side of our surveys. Even I, I through this series, I had participated one of the survey. That survey also said there are like youths migration or something was that the youths non-Dalit and Dalit, they don't think there is discrimination. There is some sort of discrimination when they go to their own house, and they have to be more focused on their parents' rules and cultures. But the consequences are very heavy. So what do we think, like the surveys we do on caste-based discrimination should focus differently in the methodological way, or like targeting to the uh, beneficiaries, or like surveillance? So what do you think in that aspects?
Yeah, sorry. Well, there are several ways to answer that. I mean, one, of course, my survey was about central Nepal,
Yeah.
where maybe there is less caste-based violence these days than in other parts of Nepal, than in the Terai and in far west. But also, my survey did show this more disturbing finding, which is that Dalits are still not welcomed in upper caste, in caste Hindu homes. So, I mean, that suggests, along with the lack of intercaste marriage, I mean, that caste, the lack of discrimination is not, public discrimination is not the end of caste, right? The annihilation of caste is not the same as, there not being insults in public and things like this. Because caste is a system of endogamy, right? It's of people having to marry within within the same group. And violence happens when people threaten that endogamy. So intercaste marriage is seen as a threat to the endogamous, pure continuation of, upper caste groups. So if we're going to try to be more specific about the causes of caste violence, I think it's when people threaten the continued privilege and the continuation as a biological entity, right, of upper caste groups that might see themselves as threatened if endogamy is threatened. So, yeah, I've got to be very careful in distinguishing what my survey is trying to do. So it's really a much more simple thing, which is just to say, is there still traditional discrimination in public places, taps, temples? And maybe that is less, but that doesn't mean that caste as a system of endogamous marriage, right, is about to disappear. It really isn't. And when Dalits threaten that system by, going to marry people from a higher caste, that's when you get violence. So yeah, caste is kind of changing into something else, but it may still be exclusionary and discriminatory for Dalits.
Okay, thank you, Professor Richard, for your interesting research findings and presentation in our today's session. Now I'm going to conclude this session because there are no more questions and remarks from participants. Um, as your research has also found that, of course, there were some limitations in your research methods, but it is evidence for discrimination or some sort of Dalit atrocities happening in that particular location as well. We also know that the um, severity of discrimination vary by the location and the space, because as we go far western part of Nepal, then we might see or feel more sort of discrimination. And at the same time, if we go to Tarai, there might be more cases of discrimination than in Kathmandu. But we should not generalize in that way, because there are evidences of discrimination in Kathmandu as well, and in Pokhara as well. Recently, there were some incidences. But anyway, this was interesting finding, and this is um, scientific evidence that shows discrimination happening in that location as well. Um, so with this statement, I'd like to congratulate you and Ratnaji, and I'd like to wish for your future research as well, because you are saying that you are going to other parts of Nepal for research on similar method. Um, and finally, I'd like to thank you all the participants as well, because you participated and interacted on Professor Richard research and his findings. So thank you all. If you have any last minute comments or remarks, you can say Professor Richard. Otherwise, I would like to stop this event here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Yeah, and thank you, Mom, for hosting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
I'm going to stop YouTube live.